I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's April 8th, and we have a lot to talk about. One of the things that can be difficult to talk about is the feeling of loss that can accompany MS. For some people, it's the loss of the way they imagine their life would turn out. For others, it's the more specific loss of function, perhaps a loss of their mobility, or a decline of their cognitive skills. It's painful to imagine any of these scenarios, let alone experience them in real life. The human response to loss is grief, and grieving itself can affect your physical, emotional, and cognitive health. Joining me today to discuss how grieving can affect you, along with ways to best manage grief, is Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. Dr. O'Connor is a professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, where she directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab. Dr. O'Connor also lives with MS, and the title of her new book is The Grieving Body: How the Stress of Loss Can Be an Opportunity for Healing. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. O'Connor, there are a few other things that you should know about. Research has shown that fatigue affects up to 80% of the people living with MS. And fatigue is one of those symptoms that just gets in the way of life, keeping you from engaging with your family or friends. And it's the number one reason that people with MS end up leaving the workforce. The results of a recent study serve to remind us that fatigue, like MS itself, is a global condition. A research team in Finland analyzed data from more than 500 people with MS from the Finnish MS registry and reported that nearly half of the people being studied reported pronounced fatigue, which negatively impacted their well-being. The researchers also reported that individuals with self-perceived fatigue were also more likely to experience mood and cognitive issues and to have a poorer quality of life, reporting a greater impact of their MS on their physical and psychological functioning. Now, I doubt this is news to anyone listening to this podcast, but it underscores the fact that while fatigue can have such a negative impact on the quality of life for such a high percentage of the MS population, there still aren't any robust treatments available for fatigue. I'm hopeful that ongoing research will reveal better news in the not-too-distant future. Meanwhile, if you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Sexual dysfunction is a common and often overlooked symptom of MS that can have a significant impact on quality of life. And recent research reveals that 80% of the women living with MS in Iran are experiencing sexual dysfunction. The researchers analyzed data from 100 married women with MS who were referred to the Bu Ali Hospital Clinic in 2020 and 2021. Each woman completed the Female Sexual Function Index questionnaire, comprised of 19 questions designed to assess an individual's sexual function. Questions on this questionnaire relate to desire, arousal, lubrication, orgasm, satisfaction, and sexual pain. The average age of the women in this study was 37.4 years old. The average time since being diagnosed with MS was about 9 years. 44% of the women were university graduates, and 75% of the women described themselves as homemakers. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the results of the study showed that 80% of these women were experiencing some level of sexual dysfunction. Factors that significantly correlated with sexual dysfunction among these women included higher disability levels, older age, having given birth more times, longer disease duration, and lower education levels. When all of these factors were analyzed together, it appeared that age and having a university degree were shown to have a significant association with sexual function, leading the research team to conclude that older and less educated women with MS were at greater risk of experiencing sexual dysfunction. Now, please consider this sort of a public service announcement, but if you're a woman with MS and your neurologist or MS specialist isn't asking about sexual dysfunction because they think they shouldn't, or they know they should but they feel a little embarrassed talking about it, then it's up to you to self-advocate and bring up that conversation. There's never a good reason for you or your doctor to ignore your MS symptoms, so please don't. If you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. The prodromal phase of a disease occurs before the classical onset of the disease. In the case of MS, the prodrome occurs before an individual experiences any of the typical symptoms of MS. Researchers are interested in the MS prodrome because it brings them closer to the time when MS actually starts in an individual. So, understanding the prodromal phase of MS gives researchers a better opportunity to identify the cause of MS. And a Canadian research team considered that analyzing employment-related sick days could provide a new perspective on better understanding the prodromal phase of MS. Research has shown that during the prodromal phase, people with MS have higher rates of doctor visits and hospitalizations. But job-related sick days might actually be a better measure of health issues that people face during the prodromal phase of MS, because those days would account for times when someone experienced a health-related absence from work, but it wasn't serious enough for them to see a doctor. Now, in Sweden, people who are employed receive sick-related benefits from the government after 15 days of sick leave from their jobs. So in this study, the research team examined the rate of sick days before someone in Sweden was diagnosed with MS. The researchers were able to incorporate Sweden's nationwide administrative healthcare data and data from the Swedish MS registry, and they identified 8,618 people with MS in the administrative healthcare data and 6,361 people with MS in the MS registry. They matched each of these individuals with up to 5 people without MS, matching them according to their length of residency in Sweden, their sex, the year they were born, and whether they lived in a rural or urban area. Looking at 18 years of data prior to the onset of MS symptoms for each individual, the research team calculated differences based on sex, age at the time of MS diagnosis, average household income, rural versus urban, and immigration status. The researchers discovered that people with MS experienced a substantially larger number of sick days in the years leading up to the onset of MS symptoms, with sick day rates significantly elevated from 6 years before the onset of MS symptoms in the administrative healthcare data group and about 2 years before the onset of MS symptoms in the MS registry group. In the year before the onset of MS symptoms, people in the administrative healthcare data group experienced sick day rates that were 2.6 times higher than the healthy control group. Now, in the year before the onset of MS symptoms, people in the administrative healthcare data group experienced sick day rates that were 2.6 times higher than the healthy control group. And people in the smaller MS registry group experienced sick day rates that were 1.2 times higher than the healthy control group. The research team also noted that among the administrative healthcare data group, the sick day rates in the year before the onset of MS were 3.5 times higher in males with MS compared to males without MS, and 2.1 times higher in females with MS compared to females without MS. Interestingly, the rate of sick days between males and females in the MS registry group didn't differ. The research team also noted that sick day rates in the year before the onset of MS symptoms also increased with an individual's age and with their income. The outcome of this analysis provides evidence of a clear deterioration of health in the years leading up to the onset of MS symptoms, and provides one more piece to the puzzle of understanding when and how MS begins. And once that puzzle picture becomes more clear, it's going to create an opportunity for clinicians to intervene with high-efficacy disease-modifying therapies that may prevent someone from ever experiencing a single MS symptom. And that's an encouraging future worthy of further exploration. Now, if you'd like to review the details of this study, or if you'd like to review my friend Sharon Roman's excellent plain English summary of this study, you'll find links to both in today's show notes. Wellness has been defined as actively pursuing a state of good health, and it's become a subject that gets written about in books, talked about on podcasts, and considered by everyone every single day. But the challenge in evaluating a specific wellness plan or program is the lack of objective evidence. So it's hard to determine whether a wellness program will be beneficial, whether it will be a waste of your time and money, or whether it might even be dangerous to someone living with MS. That's why the MS International Federation has published a guide to evidence-based wellness practices and complementary therapies for people living with MS. Information for this guide was adapted from a resource originally developed in Germany. The information has been updated and is based on scientific research as of December 2024. The guide is designed to provide some clarity about wellness practices and complementary therapies that support overall health while examining the potential benefits and risks associated with them. The guide is available in English, Spanish, and Arabic, and if you'd like to download a copy of this worthwhile guide, you'll find that link in today's show notes. Part of pursuing a sense of wellness when you're living with a chronic progressive condition like MS means learning how to process loss in a healthy way, and that means understanding how grief interacts with MS. Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor lives with MS and studies grief in the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab at the University of Arizona. Dr. O'Connor joins me in a moment as we take a deep dive into managing grief and MS. Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor is a professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, where she directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab, investigating the effects of grief on the brain and the body. Dr. O'Connor holds a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Arizona and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in psychoneuroimmunology at the UCLA Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. Dr. O'Connor's book, The Grieving Brain, was included on Oprah's list of best books to comfort a grieving friend, and her new book is titled The Grieving Body: How the Stress of Loss Can Be an Opportunity for Healing. And Dr. O'Connor lives with MS. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. O'Connor.
It's lovely to be here, John.
In the opening pages of your book, you write, loss due to chronic illness and loss due to bereavement both involve the unbearable cloak of grieving, weighing on you every day, shaping what you think, what you do, and your beliefs about the future. Shaping what you think, what you do, and your beliefs about the future. Tell me about that.
I've been studying grief, the response to loss, for all of my career for over 25 years now. And my own experience of having MS was very much that I could relate to people who had experienced the death of a loved one who didn't quite know how to function in the world without that person, in part because of similarly not knowing how I was going to be able to function in the world with the symptoms of MS or the uncertainty of the future because of having MS. And so the overlap seemed really clear to me. And I think I benefited a lot from understanding how grieving works as I tried to adapt it to my own diagnosis.
And may I ask when you were diagnosed and what your MS journey has been like?
Yeah, I was about 26 years old when I was diagnosed. And what's interesting about it that I understand better now is that my mother died about a year before I was diagnosed. Now, I'm very, very clear. I understand the immunology. My mother's loss didn't cause my MS. I have a family history. My dad's aunt has MS. And I have a number of other risk factors. So it's not terribly surprising ultimately that I developed MS. But the timing of when it became clear, when my symptoms became so disruptive that I sought medical treatment, no longer surprises me that it was during the stress of grieving for my mom that my body really wasn't able to be resilient enough to sort of maintain health. And so when I was diagnosed, they told me, well, the first 5 years will tell you a lot about what your MS is going to look like. And I thought, what? How 5 years? Like, how does anyone make any decisions about their life, as a 26-year-old? If it's going to be that long to figure out what this is going to feel like. And of course, what I find interesting about that is bereaved people also take a long time to adapt to a life without their spouse or their child or their parent or whomever it is. And so it's another parallel there. My initial symptoms were paresthesia, the sort of tingling type feelings most people describe that way, and overwhelming fatigue. And some vertigo as well. So most of my symptoms have been in the sensory domain more so than the muscle or those other kinds of, it doesn't affect my gait or my vision, for example.
Living with MS often means living with loss. And
Yeah.
and depending upon the level of disability someone might be experiencing, that sense of loss can be profound.
Yeah.
Grieving is a common response to loss. How might grieving physically affect an individual?
It's such a good question. I think that most of us aren't aware that even grieving the death of a loved one is actually a physical response as well as an emotional response. And so we know even in bereavement research that we see changes in the immune system and we see changes in the cardiovascular system. So for example, research of mine and now research in bigger studies from other labs shows that people who are grieving the death of a loved one often have increased inflammation. So inflammation being a response of the immune system ordinarily to something like a bacteria or a virus, but inflammation can occur under conditions of chronic stress as well. So we know that grief in the traditional sense, grieving over a loved one can cause changes in inflammation. What I think we also have come to understand is that our chronic stress response to all sorts of losses in our life can include changes in our immune system. When we are, having a stress reaction that might include increased adrenaline to cope with a stressor or increased cortisol to cope with a stressor, those things affect our immune system. Those hormones affect our immune system as well and can make us more susceptible to viruses or colds, for example, when we're undergoing that chronic stress. So with MS, it's even more complex because those of us with MS have an immune system that is often highly reactive, or we take medications that are already impacting our immune competence. And so I think that knowing the similarities can help us psychologically. One final example that I will give you that I have found very useful is that we know there's two common responses that people have after the death of a loved one called protest and despair. And we actually see this even in animals, even in infants, through attachment research. We see protest and despair. And protest is sort of, if you imagine looking down and your child isn't next to you in the grocery store where you were expecting them to be, that feeling, that energized feeling of, oh no, what's happened? Where are they? Right? That's the feeling of protest. And despair is, oh no, they are really gone. That very withdrawn, the feeling of being dragged down by the reality. Well, many people will describe those two responses to a diagnosis as well. This can't be happening. No, this isn't right. And also, oh, I have to live with this forever, right? And so when we're, in protest, often we're, I can speak for myself, the idea of, no, I can do anything, even though I have this diagnosis, right? I can work all the hours and I can walk all the blocks and so forth because I can't believe this is real. And on the flip side, the despair of, I will never be able to do anything. I'll never be able to get my degree, or I'll never be able to have children or whatever, because I have this, is sort of a part of despair. And those are natural responses, but sometimes it helps to know that those are part of grieving and that they're temporary responses. We can work with those so that we can find a way to still create a meaningful life, whether our loss is of a loved one or whether it is of health.
We've touched on the physical impact of grieving, the emotional impact of grieving. What's the cognitive impact of grieving?
Many people will describe having difficulty thinking after the death of a loved one. Some people now use the term brain fog. And one of the things that's challenging, I write about this in The Grieving Body, is that actually everyone uses brain fog in a slightly different way. So different people mean different things when they say brain fog. Some people mean, I park my car and then I come back and I can't find it. And other people mean I can't somehow carry the one when I'm trying to do my taxes, So people mean different things when they say brain fog. What we see from neuropsychological research on bereavement after the death of a loved one is that there's a very small decline in overall what we would call global cognition. And what that mostly means is that there's no specific part of the brain that's broken, after a loved one dies. But that doesn't mean it's not real, that people aren't experiencing brain fog. So what we think is going on is that when a loved one dies, every single situation you are in, you suddenly have to relearn. You're in the grocery store and you're just doing your shopping and you pull the soy milk off the shelf and you put it in the basket. And then you remember, oh, my daughter who's lactose intolerant and drinks soy milk isn't with us anymore. I don't have to buy soy milk. And you put it back on the shelf, right? So the simple act of just doing the grocery shopping suddenly requires all this mental and emotional energy. So I think that the reason that our brain doesn't seem to be working quite right is more like, have you ever been trying to type a document on your computer while in the background your computer is downloading some program? And the typing doesn't work quite right, the letters sputter out and then there's a pause, and there's nothing wrong with your computer. Your computer is not broken. It is just really using all its processing power in the background, and that's preventing you from doing the task in the foreground that you'd like to be doing. I think of grieving as a similar thing. Your brain is really busy trying to process what has happened and help you to function in your day-to-day life, but it's taking extra time to do that.
It seems to me that in those moments when your brain is trying to function and all that other stuff is going on in the background, when you have that realization, when you're in the supermarket and you have to put that item back on the shelf, that also becomes a trigger in that moment, doesn't it?
That's right. Exactly. So it's not just, it's not like you just have to learn a new set of habits because you're taller now or something. You have to learn a new set of habits because something really devastating has happened. And so these are triggers then for emotional moments. I can tell you, I myself have, gotten teared up in the middle of the grocery store. I think we've all had experiences of being caught off guard by a wave of grief after loved ones have died. And that takes its own energy and effort and sort of a toolkit of coping strategies to try to figure out how to get through just your regular grocery trip after a loved one has died.
So, how do people cope with grieving, and how can those coping behaviors affect someone's physical health?
I like to think about the idea that we can have a big toolkit of coping strategies because it turns out that in different situations, you kind of need different strategies to cope with a wave of grief. So the strategy that I might use if I'm, just about to walk into a work meeting and I'm finding myself thinking about my dad who has died is going to be a different strategy that I'm going to use than on a Saturday afternoon when I'm on the phone with my sister and I'm thinking about, our dad having died. And so I think just knowing that you have a lot of choices, right? So in the moment before I'm going into a work meeting, I think denial and avoidance is a totally appropriate strategy. You can sort of say to yourself, you know what? I can't get upset about this right now. I really have to be able to go in and do my work here. I'm going to put a pin in this and I'm going to think about it later. But right now, I'm going to pretend it never happened, If that's the only coping strategy that you have, I'm not going to think about this. That's probably not going to help you adapt very well in the long term. But as one of your coping strategies, that's perfectly fine. If you also have the strategy of being able to talk with people about what your loved one meant to you and how important those memories are to you, how much that they continue to influence your life, and the sadness and yearning you might have, or the guilt or anger that you might have, finding ways to talk about those with people you're close with who are able to offer you comfort or even just witness your experience, how difficult this is for you. That's a different type of coping strategy of relying on your support system and being able to talk through what you're feeling and thinking. And those types of ways of addressing waves of grief over the long term, the vast majority of us are surprisingly resilient. We do come to develop a life that includes waves of grief, but less intensely and less frequently than early on after a loss. Becoming familiar with a wave of grief, knowing that it will well up, but it will also recede like a wave, can be very reassuring as we sort of get through the days and then weeks and then months and even years. Grief doesn't actually go away. The fact that you have a loss is just always going to be true. But we get better at learning how to have grief and how to have a lot of other feelings and thoughts and activities as well.
As you were describing one of those coping mechanisms in particular, I thought to myself, just last month was MS Awareness Month, and in that month was MS Awareness Week. And the National MS Society, what they invited people to do was to talk to their MS, and many of them put up videos and what have you, but just kind of telling your MS how you felt about it.
That is beautiful. And I think it's such an important, it sounds a little bit strange, but we have a relationship with this body, with these symptoms, with these experiences. And I love the idea of being able to express something to your body or your symptoms or your experiences. Everything from, there's a guided meditation that I do. And one of the phrases in the meditation is about thanking your body for the things that it is able to do for you. And I've always found it deeply moving because when you're struggling with things that your body won't do or won't do regularly, or you don't know if it's going to be able to do them, it can be really easy to forget that it is actually doing all sorts of things for you all the time. And that feeling of gratitude really shifts, I think. You can have anger or frustration and gratitude at the same time. And that's a very different experience than only having anger or frustration.
That's important. So, what's the path forward for someone who may be grieving the loss of a loved one or someone who may be living with a particularly aggressive or progressive case of multiple sclerosis? What's their path to a better sense of well-being?
I think it's important to know that we can have a disease, we can be grieving, and we can also have mental health. Both can be true. And I think that for many of us, mental health is about being able to fully participate in the life that we are living, even with the constraints that that life has. And so, for me, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do all the things that I had wanted to do when I was 26 before I was diagnosed. And I also knew that I could fully enjoy the things that I was able to do. And so I hesitate to say something that sounds like rose-colored glasses, because that is not actually, I think, the best form of mental health. Rose-colored glasses often exclude things that are happening for people, right? And so I think about the idea of having a rich life, incorporating the good things and the bad things, and finding the ways to connect with other people, especially around both celebrating the good things and also allowing people to share the burden when things are really difficult, and to find ways that they may be meaningful. I'll give you a simple example. When my dad was older, he needed to stop driving, and he was really struggling with this. And I said to him at one point, he'd had a car accident, and it was really important. He really needed to stop. And I said to him at one point, I said, "Dad, my memory of you when I was a kid was that you used to go pick people up in your car and take them to church and take them to doctor's appointments." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Did you enjoy doing that?" And he was like, "Oh, absolutely. I felt so connected with my neighborhood, and I got to hear great stories from, older folks." And I said, "Dad, this is the time to give that gift to someone else. Someone else wants to drive you. Someone else wants the opportunity to feel useful." And that really shifted things for him. I think he felt like less of a burden and more like, this is just the fabric of the people in our lives, and we do the things to make that fabric work in the places that make sense.
The name of the book is The Grieving Body: How the Stress of Loss Can Be an Opportunity for Healing. Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, I want to thank you for helping people find a way forward when their lives have been interrupted in the saddest and sometimes most tragic ways. And thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thanks so much for bringing this conversation to people. It was good to talk to you, John.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/397. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.